Some huge changes are happening to the Florida housing market. So for example, around 85% of the biggest metro areas in Florida have lower home prices today than they did 1 year ago. So only 15% are flat or higher than 1 year ago. And on top of that, housing inventory has been absolutely skyrocketing as well. But despite this large increase of housing supply, or the amount of houses for sale, pending home sales actually decreased. I have a lot to share in today's video based on this new report from the Florida Realtors based on my own analysis. Of course, if you guys get any value out of this video, then please hit the like button. Also consider subscribing as well. I post as much as I can frequent housing market updates so you guys can be more informed. With that said, I have a lot to share in today's video. Thank you so much for joining me, and let's begin. So let's first talk about closed home sales. This is for the month of April. We're only talking about single family houses in the state of Florida in today's video. And April's numbers was just announced a couple weeks ago. We won't have May's numbers for about 2 weeks from now. So anyways, looking at April numbers, there was around 23,000 closed home sales. That was down 4.5% year over year. And like I mentioned, pending home sales are down, but also as you guys can see, closed home sales are down as well, despite this giant increase in the amount of houses for sale, which I'll share with you guys here in a little bit. Now in today's video, just like I do for all my Florida updates, I tend to make this video about once per month. I want to share how these figures compare to years past, especially looking at pre-pandemic levels back in 2017 and 2019. So for example, as you can see, kind of this chart right here, here's January this year, January, February, March, April. We're kind of seeing this seasonal uptick in home sales in Florida, like we do more or less every single year, right? However, having said that, it's obviously much less or much more subdued compared to what we saw in 21 and 22. As you guys can see, around 23,000 homes for sale right now. Back in 22, for example, back in April, for example, we had just less than 30,000 closed home sales. 21, obviously we had a lot more home sales because we had 3% rates, but back then we had over 30,000 sales. Also looking back before the pandemic hit back in April 2020-ish, this is also below what happened in April of 2019. Back then there was around 27,000 home sales. Now there's less than 24,000. So to summarize this snapshot, we are seeing a seasonal uptick in sales so far this year, but it's still historically low levels. Okay, let's also look at this as well. This is the percent of cash sales in Florida for the month of April. That was around 28%. This means that around 1/3 of all home sales came from a cash buyer. That is slightly down from last year at this time when that ratio was at 30%. All right, let's change gears slightly here and talk about home prices based on the median sold price. So this is pretty wild because for the month of April, that was just less than $413,000. That is a decrease down by 4% from 12 months ago. This is quite the difference compared to with what we saw back in April 24. Back then, prices were up by 4.9%. So the delta of the change of that is around 11%, right? Going from 4.9 up, now it's down 4%. On top of that, this is actually the biggest year-over-year decrease going all the way back until October of 2011. Obviously, a huge decrease compared to 1 year ago, the biggest decline, a yearly decline since October of 2011. However, prices have still increased by about 50% compared to April of 2020. So big picture, people who bought houses prior to COVID likely have a ton of equity in their houses, unless of course they're doing cash out refis, taking out a second loan on their home, for example. But for those who are not doing that, they probably have a lot of equity in their houses. But for people who bought homes more recently, they're more or less seeing home prices relatively flat over the past 3 years. Now here's a chart looking at home prices since January of 21. As you guys can see, home prices haven't really fluctuated very much. They have been around 400,000 ever since really the spring home buying season or the summer months of 2022. But obviously before that, especially 21, look at that. January 21, we started at 300,000, and then to end the year, there was around 375,000. So a big increase that year. Also, we saw a big increase in 20 as well, but more or less it has been flat for several years now. Now, here's something I found to be really interesting as well. Here is the percent of the original list price received. So let me just kind of explain this for you guys. Back in April, that ratio was 95.5%. This means that houses on average that did sell in April sold for 4.5% less than the seller's original listing price or asking price. For comparison's sake, that's less than what we saw last year when the ratio was at 96.5%, but also it was at 100% back in April of 21. So back in April 21, obviously people are rushing to buy houses due to 3% interest rates. But back then, the average sale price was at 100%. This means that homes on average sold for the seller's original asking price on average. Now they're selling for about 4.5% less than the asking price. So clearly, the market has definitely slowed down since the craziness of 20 and 21. Now, before I get into pending home sales and of course housing inventory, some very big changes here, I want to share this as well because homes on average are taking much longer to sell compared to previous years. In fact, it's up by 22.9% year over year. It's taken about 43 days to sell a home. This means you list your home for sale. It takes approximately 43 days until you accept an offer from a home buyer. For comparison's sake, back in April of 21, that days in the market was around 11 days. As you guys can see right here, back in April 21, it was around 11 days and was hanging around that level all year that year. And of course, right now, much more elevated given the 7% rates we're seeing more or less today. Also, look back at pre-COVID 17 through 19. 43 days is more or less in line with what we saw back in April of 2019. So therefore, homes on average are taking more or less the same time to sell compared to pre-COVID levels. All right, let's get into nuts and bolts here because this is a pretty big disparity between demand, pending home sales versus inventory or the amount of houses for sale. So pending home sales decreased by 4.7% year over year. There was just over 25,000 contracts being accepted. In other words, home sellers accepting offers from home buyers 25,000 times in April. So pendings fell despite a large amount of houses for sale. On top of that, 25,000 pending sales is the fewest amount for any April since at least April of 2017. If we were to exclude April of 2020, back then, of course, we had COVID lockdowns. All right, so now we know that we have the fewest amount of pending home sales since at least April of 2017 for the month of April, excluding the onset of COVID. But despite that, we have more listings. So new listings rose by 2.7%. So more inventory come in the market, yet transactions actually fell. Something that's kind of interesting because I would say probably about a year or two ago, new listings were absolutely skyrocketing. Actually, let's look at the chart here. It was actually 2022, my bad. In 22, new listings were skyrocketing. Now they're kind of been flat more or less this year, only up by 2.7%. Compare this to 12 months ago, we were up by 25%. So even though new listings are still at elevated levels, the gains are actually losing momentum. Okay, now here's where it gets really, really interesting because even though we're seeing a decrease in closed home sales, a decrease in contracts being signed or pending home sales, inventory is up by 33.3%. So we have a lot more options for home buyers, yet buyers are not taking advantage of those, the increase of options for them, right? So 117,000 active listings as the end of April this year. That is higher than any other month since at least January of 2017. That's as far back as I can see in their data. I'm guessing it's probably way back in probably around 2011, 2012 is my guess. So inventory is at very elevated levels overall for the state. On top of that, it has also nearly doubled over the past 2 years. So inventory has increased by 95% over the past 2 years alone. How crazy is that? Also, despite this rise of 33%, like I mentioned in housing supply, pending home sales fell. So we're seeing this big imbalance between supply and demand. And in fact, here's a chart looking at inventory. It has been steadily increasing since the late, I would call it the late summer months of 2023. Steadily rising ever since then, much different compared to 21 and early 22. Back then we had around 30,000 homes for sale. Now we have 117,000. What a difference a few years makes. It's absolutely crazy. Now here's something as well, because the amount of houses for sale are at very high levels, but also the month supply is also elevated as well. So the month supply is at 5.6 months. I would call this a buyer's market because 1 year ago it was at 4.1 months. So 5.6 months. This basically means if people stop listing their houses for sale, if new listings stopped altogether at the current sales pace, all the houses for sale, it would take 5.6 months to sell all those houses. At the peak of the Great Recession in California, for example, you guys all know I'm a realtor here in Sacramento. At the peak of the Great Recession in California, our housing supply was at a 16-month supply. Now in Florida, it's 5.6 months. Very much elevated because this is the highest level for any month since at least January of 2017, but it pales in comparison to what we saw back in the Great Recession. Also, I did some digging for you guys as well. The month supply back in 2017 through 18 was around a 4-month supply. So at 5.6 months right now, it's of course elevated compared to pre-COVID levels. The Florida Realtors also provided this as well, which I kind of found to be interesting because we're not seeing a giant uptick in luxury home sales like we saw in 21, for example. So back in April this year, for home sales that closed for over $1 million, that decreased by 11.5%. It also fell for basically all these price tiers for more than $300,000. In contrast, we did see an increase in the price range of $100,000 to $150,000. So we're seeing a decrease in close-home sales at the upper range of the market. And of course, that could kind of impact the overall median sold price in the state as a whole due to the mix in sales, a decrease of more expensive properties, and an increase of less expensive properties. Now, speaking of that, here's a look at the amount of houses for sale by price range. And just kind of like an overall big picture here, every single price tier has seen a huge increase in the amount of houses for sale, all increasing by more than 10% or more than 15%. So therefore, we're not just seeing a huge uptick in more affordable houses for sale or more expensive homes for sale. All price tiers are increasing greatly, mostly up by more than 25%. Okay, I want to share some citywide stats with you guys here in a little bit. But first, I want to share this as well because I think there's a lot of misnomers regarding foreclosures in Florida for condos, but also for single-family houses. So the data supports that, right? So back in April this year, of course, so traditional home sales, this is just a regular home sale. It's not a short sale, not a foreclosure. There was 23,376 closed home sales for single-family houses. Yet there was only 156,000 foreclosures and only 40 short sales. This means there was less than 1% of all home sales in April came from a distressed home sale, either a foreclosure or a short sale. Therefore, 99% were just regular old-fashioned sales. I also looked at the market report for condos and townhomes as well, because looking at those, I was expecting to see a much bigger percentage of condos and townhomes that have been foreclosed on, but that is actually not the case because in April, for example, less than 1% came from a distressed home sale for condos, which is more or less the same looking at single family houses. All right, so that was looking at Florida as a whole. Of course, every market's different. I want to share the markets, I would say kind of the biggest markets in Florida that had at least 500 closed home sales this last April. And when looking at that, I found a very interesting stat here. So out of the 14 largest metro areas in Florida, again, at least 500 sales for the month, only one had an increase in their median sale price. And only one was flat compared to 1 year ago. Therefore, 85% of Florida's biggest metros have lower home prices this April compared to April of 2024. The only increase was actually in Crestview, Fort Walton Beach, and Destin metro area. Their median sale price rose by 2.4%. Every other metro, though, actually decreased except for Miami. The Miami MSA prices there were flat year over year. In contrast, in Northport, Sarasota, their median sale price decreased a whopping 13.1%. In Punta Gorda, Florida, it decreased by 10.9%. And in Tampa, St. Petersburg MSA, it decreased by 4.3%. When we have a look at closed home sales in the state, this is pretty wild as well. Looking at the biggest metros, every single one of these actually fell year over year. So a lower level of prices, but also a lower level of closed home sales as well. With excluding one metro area, which is this right here. Punta Gorda, the metro area, sales actually rose by 10%. In contrast, look at these other metros. I tend to look at the bigger metros because they can have bigger fluctuations on a month-to-month basis and a yearly basis if you have a low level of transactions. So Miami sales decreased by 9%. Then we have Daytona Beach, Florida, down by 8%. And Crestview, Fort Walton is actually down by 7.9%. With that said, if you guys have boots on the ground in Florida, what are you guys seeing? Are you guys looking for a house to buy there? Are you looking to sell a home? Or are you a real estate agent? So please provide your feedback about what you're seeing in the Florida housing market. So that's today's video. Thank you everyone for watching today's video. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.